So we're in southeast Sutherland here, in the strip of good agricultural land that there is between the sea and the hills. And we're looking up here towards Fluchery. This is a crofting area, and you can see the forestry on the right-hand side there. That's the Harriet Plantation. There used to be some little settlements in there which have all been covered up by the trees. What you're seeing there is a landscape, an improvement landscape, as the terminology has it, of crofts. So what we have here is an 18th century longhouse. Now, longhouses in Sutherland could be anything from about 40 foot long to about 100 foot long. And nuclear families would live in these houses, and they would also have a space for their livestock. So I'm standing at the very top of the longhouse, and you can see that it stretches all the way down there. So this is all one house for one family. I'm standing in what I suspect is the living quarters or the sleeping quarters. If we move down here a little bit, you can see that there is a wall crossing over, an interior wall. And this is separating the two rooms used for living. You would have a fire, an open fire, in the middle of one of these rooms, and the smoke would percolate up through the thatch roof. And then down at the very far end, you would have the byre or the stable. You would bring the animals in the winter time. You might have, for example, 4 cows. You might have the milk cow, its calf, a year-old, and a 2-year-old. And every year you'd be selling one of them to the drover. You might also have a few sheep and a few goats. And they would spend the winter in this area down here. You'll note that it's at the bottom. The whole house is built on a slope, and the livestock are kept at the bottom so that all of the mess can drain out. We're still here at Ristockich, which is quite high up the Eve Lakes Valley. So we're a few miles inland from the sea, and we're up where the land starts becoming a little bit more marginal. We've already seen the 18th century longhouse. In the 19th century, people lived in croft houses, and this is an example of a croft house. This was known as the East House, and we know that there were people living here in 1871. There's a Hugh Mackay, who was 62, and his wife Marion Mackay, who was 65, and they would have lived here. I'm standing in the doorway of their croft house. Now, if we look around us, you can see the land that they were farming. There are some areas for fields, and you can also see that there's some hillside. Now, the hillside was an important part of each farm or each croft. That is where you grazed the animals, and you can still see the difference between the areas that were arable, where they would have grown things like oats, barley, potatoes, turnips, and the areas that were known as the outfield, which is today covered in heather. This is the second croft house that is on the site at Ristockich. You can see we've got a small building here, and one of the walls has been completely removed, but we can still see the far wall here. Now, we can date this approximately. We know that it's at least the mid-19th century because it is a gable wall. That's a feature that the longhouses didn't have. And you can just see the outlines of a fireplace. Here in the middle of the wall, you can see where the chimney would have been set into the wall. You can also see a little cubby hole in the far end of the wall. And this was a Bible locker. And it would have had little wooden doors over it, and it probably would have been wood lined as well, and it is where they stored one of the most precious goods that the family had, their family Bible. At the far side of the second croft house here at Ristockich, we can see some of the areas where they would have done their farming. This is the stack yard, which is outside of the croft house. And this is where they would have, for example, brought in the hay and the other crops that they had produced on their croft. The family who lived here were a young couple. There was Hugh, who was 47, Jane, who was 35, and they had two young children, Barbara, aged 2, and John, who was a year old. So they would have spent a lot of time around this area. And you can see over here, we've got some remnants. This area here of stones was a little platform where they would put their stack of hay. And it's a good place because it's sheltered. The house itself and the stackyard has been built in to the drumlin here with the trees growing on it, which is a glacial feature and which provides the house and the byre and the stackyard with a little bit of shelter. We're standing here on the shores of Loch Fleet. Again, we're in southeast Sutherland on the east coast of the Highlands. I'm standing on what is today Skelbo Farm. You can see behind me there's a couple of fields, and these fields are, you can see that they're quite square, they're divided off by stands of trees and by stone dikes. Now the landscape here has changed significantly in the last 200 years ago. If we were standing here about 200 years ago, there wouldn't be these big square fields. You would have a series of strips, run rigs, and people grew their oats and their barley, their potatoes and so on these strips of land, these mounds. And they lived in little townships all over the place. And what happened in the early 19th century is that the Sutherland family were very keen on improvement agriculture. And a lot of these ideas were inspired by the Enlightenment. And one of the ideas was that you could be much more efficient if you had one big farm. And this was also helpful for you as a landlord, because it meant you only had to collect one rent, and probably from someone who could afford it a lot more than your subtenants could. So it was efficient in terms of your estate management, and it was agriculturally more commercial. And that was the great thing coming out of the Enlightenment, was how good moving from subsistence to a commercial approach was. And so what they did was they cleared the people from these areas and replaced them with one tenant farmer, and they flattened the run rigs and they turned them into these lovely big fields here. Larger fields were also more efficient when it came to using some of the improved methods of farming. You can use bigger ploughs, and when mechanisation comes in the 19th century, you need a bigger space to be able to do that. We're standing on part of Skelbo Farm. Not far from here, there was a township, Bala, Clachan, that people lived in before the creation of Skelbo Farm in the 1810s. That place was called Achandra. There's no trace of it now, there's just some modern houses and some fields and some croft land. But people lived there, and they did run rig agriculture, and there would have been a small number of subtenants who all paid rent. When Skelbo Farm was created, these people were removed, and they were given 3 options. They could go to some of the towns, the villages, Golspie, Brora, Dornoch, where they could pick up and learn a new trade or work in one of the factories or manufactories that was being set up by the Duke as part of their improvement project on the Sutherland estate. That was one option. Another option was to take up an improvement lease and be given a croft. Now, these crofts were a couple of miles up the road beyond today's A9, and the land was what had been previously used as the outfield for the cattle. So it was not good agricultural land like we have down here. It was fairly rough land. And the idea on an improvement lease was that you'd pay a very small amount of rent at first, and then as you worked on the land and you made it more productive, you would pay more and more rent until it was at a commercial level. So it was very hard work creating arable land out of fairly marginal land. And if you go and explore that area today, you will find that one of the crofting areas is called Achvandra Muir. So they took the name from here, and what you're seeing there with Achvandra Muir is, of course, it was the moor where they had the cattle, and now that is the name of the crofting area. So that was your second option. You could take an improvement lease on a croft. Your third option was to become an agricultural labourer on Skelbo Farm. And the row of houses that we can see here today, now these are all modern houses, but they are all built on the line of farm cottages that was created for the agricultural labourers needed for Skelbo Farm. And it's no coincidence that they're in a lovely straight line. And this is where, again, we get Enlightenment principles of rationality and order being imposed on the landscape. Now, these three options, which are a little different from the options that normally face people who lived on the west coast, but one of the key things is that each of these options involved a loss of social and economic status. You went from being a subtenant where you and the people who lived with you in your township got to make the decisions about the form of agriculture you take, about how you would make your living with your cattle and your crops that year, and you became a waged labourer. So you were downwardly mobile.